Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome. My name is Max Mattern. I'm a senior financial sector specialist at CGAP, which is a global think tank housed within the World Bank that focuses on inclusive financial services. And more specifically, I lead CGAP's work exploring financial solutions to build more inclusive, more impactful carbon markets. And I think this is really interesting coming right off the previous session, which really focused on integrity and high integrity carbon markets. We're going to talk about the flip side of that, which is how do we ensure high impact within global carbon markets, and also how does that contribute to these goals of high integrity? Because obviously, if we want permanence within carbon projects, a lot of that relies on ensuring that communities are really seeing benefits from the work that we're doing. So I'm going to start off and give you just a very kind of brief framing of the issue before turning it over to Axel, who will give you an overview of how the Article 6 markets coming online is going to present an opportunity for higher impact carbon projects to actually monetize that impact. And then we have a distinguished panel of experts who will talk about solutions to actually crowding in capital to actually scale these high impact markets and to take advantage of some of the growing opportunities in global carbon markets. So without further ado, I just want to explain what we see as the case for inclusivity and impact within global carbon markets. So first, I think everyone in this room would agree that a green transition can really unlock opportunity and contribute to many of the sustainable development goals that we're all so committed to achieving by 2030. Of course, green transitions can have important impacts on a range of different outcomes, from health to improved livelihoods to gender equality. But what we see is that, unfortunately, high costs, limited availability, and behavior change are barriers, especially in emerging markets and developing economies. I like to use, first of all, this example of the cost difference between a solar water pump and a traditional diesel water pump in Bangladesh. So as you can see from this study, the cost of a diesel water pump, the upfront cost, the capex, is much, much lower. But over the lifetime of that pump, a solar water pump will yield significant cost savings. Now, for many of us in this room, we might look at that and say, okay, I'm going to invest more upfront in order to realize those cost savings over time. However, when you're talking about people who are dealing with limited incomes, the choice to actually make that upfront investment when they also have urgent needs like paying for school fees, putting food on the table, investing in their small business, of course they're going to make the choice to go with the lower cost option. And that in turn has implications for availability of green technologies and practices. Especially in harder to reach rural areas where it can be quite expensive to actually serve customers, if customers are not able to pay at a price point that covers that cost of operations, then there just won't be any distribution or availability. And this holds true for nature-based solutions as well. Things like regenerative agriculture. If farmers are not able to afford or cope with some of the upfront costs, then we're not going to have service providers that are actually going to deliver these solutions, especially at the last mile. And then, of course, comes behavior change. Trying to change long-standing behaviors, whether it's how we cook, whether it's how we transport ourselves, whether it's how we farm. It's incredibly difficult. And so we need to find ways to actually provide incentives to actually make these changes in behavior yield meaningful benefits to those who we're trying to reach. And that's where we see an opportunity in carbon markets. Carbon finance can actually unlock climate finance that addresses each of these barriers. We can increase the availability of green technologies and practices in emerging markets by actually leveraging carbon revenues to subsidize the costs of operations for businesses, for nonprofits that are actually serving customers at the last mile. We can improve the affordability by subsidizing the cost. And importantly, we can also provide incentives for behavior change. But I think it's really important to note that we can only do this if carbon projects are truly inclusive. Right now, many projects are actually failing to really truly realize the potential of driving impact beyond just mitigation outcomes. And how we would define inclusive carbon projects is across 4 dimensions. The first is ensuring community participation. This means that not only a select few can actually reap the benefits of carbon finance, but rather that entire communities are engaged and involved throughout the process, whether it's being employed within the project or making key decisions about how benefits are invested in their communities. Secondly, and this cuts across everything, is gender equality. One of the things that we've seen in our research at CGAP, and it's something that I don't think gets discussed enough, is that women face key barriers to participating in carbon projects. Many of the same barriers that they face in things like participating in agricultural value chains or accessing formal financial services. These are also barriers that we see within carbon projects, and we can't really truly realize inclusivity in carbon projects unless we also pursue gender equality. Thirdly, we need to ensure that benefit sharing is fair, transparent, equitable. Too often, we look at benefit sharing as kind of leaving a little bit of something for the community, but really the main benefits are flowing to investors, to global corporates that are trying to clean up the mess that they've been creating. But in reality, what we have to realize is that these communities have contributed next to nothing to the current climate crisis. So if we're going to ask them to clean up our mess, we need to make sure that they're seeing meaningful benefits. And that includes that they're seeing development impacts, that there are outcomes from these projects that go beyond just mitigation. And so if we actually do want to see more inclusive carbon projects, we also have to address what I see as one of the key and most fundamental barriers, which is access to capital. Solving for project finance for carbon projects is obviously a critical constraint, and it's something that was touched on in the last session. But it becomes particularly salient when we're talking about high impact inclusive carbon projects. Because first, it's important to mention that inclusion comes at a cost. Lengthy FPIC processes at the beginning, large upfront investments in engaging with communities, if you want to actually share meaningful revenues with communities, all of these things cost money. And at the same time, what we see is that some of the risks, some of the issues in the global market, carbon markets infrastructure that were addressed in the last session, also are leading many commercial banks, investors, to actually hesitate to step in and provide financing. So risks such as price volatility, delivery risk, political risk, all of this stands in the way of actually unlocking greater access to capital for carbon projects. And more importantly, if we're talking about wanting to share the maximum amount with communities, we need to ensure that that cost of capital actually allows these projects to share a meaningful portion of the revenue. And unfortunately, right now, for many projects, their cost of capital is just incredibly high. And this is where we see a key role for the development community. Multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, impact investors to play a role. And we'll get into that in a second. But first, just to kind of frame the conversation and ground us, I wanted to invite Axel Michailova, who's a senior founding partner at Perspectives Climate Group and president of the Zurich Carbon Markets Foundation, to take the stage. He'll walk us through how Article 6 is presenting new opportunities for high-impact carbon projects. Axel?
Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be part of this event. I'm also pleased to see that the finance community is starting to see carbon markets as a serious opportunity, because in my 30 years working on international carbon markets, I sometimes felt that the financial industry and banks were standing on the sidelines and looking a bit amused what was brewing there, but were not really engaging. And yeah, just to correct, I was the founding president of the Zurich Carbon Market Association. I'm currently only a member of the board. But our association actually wants to build bridges between researchers, between companies, not only in Zurich, which is a thriving hub of carbon market activity, but in a more broader sense. So I will, okay, this is interesting because it is not my presentation. So I hope that the presentation will come up, and when it is up, of course, I will continue, but I should note that international carbon markets have had two lives, and the first two lives were actually boom and bust lives. So we had the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, which in only 2 years was really developing into hundreds of projects, eventually in more than 100 developing countries. But then the credibility of the mechanism was put into doubt. The NGOs started to criticize it. The media started to criticize it. The European Union, as has already been alluded to, actually no longer wanted credits from the clean development mechanism in the European emission trading scheme, and that was the start of the end. The price of the credits fell by 90%, and of course, the market was essentially dead. We had the second international carbon market, the voluntary carbon market. It came mostly up with Greta Thunberg's Friday for Future movement, because that led to a strong societal engagement in climate change. And that, of course, led the companies to think about, what can we do about climate change mitigation? And if we can't mitigate ourselves, then, of course, we need international carbon markets. We need to be able to buy carbon credits. So, well, the slides are not yet there, so I'll just continue. And the voluntary carbon market, like its predecessor, like the CDM, came up in a massive way, especially in the context of forestry, nature-based solutions. But then history repeated itself. And I have to be sad to say that the company that was represented on the days by South Pole in Zurich, a big leader of the voluntary carbon market, had serious issues with its avoided deforestation projects. They were criticized by The Guardian for overcrediting, for not being additional, and South Pole was unable to answer these questions. And then, of course, once the first scandal erupted, journalists from all over the world chased other scandals, and that's why this market again got into the downward spiral. Prices for forestry credits fell from $15 per ton to almost nothing, and now everybody tries to repair the problems in the voluntary market, but we still have a huge overhang of unsold credits, and we have really an uphill battle to make companies and the society believe in the voluntary carbon market having a future. And now we have the third attempt, which is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And I'm really glad, actually 18 months ago I would not have been able to say this, that this market is on the right track, because it is learning the lessons from the past. It has now rules that can be credible and stable over a long period of time. For example, the conundrum of additionality. You have to show that a project would not have happened without the revenue of the carbon credits. Otherwise, it's just business as usual and should not generate carbon credits. The additionality rules now, they are really good in the context of the Article 6.4, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, and I hope that the voluntary carbon market will follow suit. Same issue for the baseline. Setting the baseline is a critical aspect of defining the volume of the carbon credits. If your baseline is overestimated, your credit is not credible. So the Article 6.4 mechanism has now decided that baselines need to be downward adjustment in the long term. That means you need a discount. Every year the baseline gets stricter. And at some point in time, I would argue that should be the time when actually the host country of the project has committed to net zero, then the baseline should be zero. There should no longer be emission credits for emission reductions. Of course, there may still be emission credits for removals, but even there, maybe there are certain baseline removals that are necessary to reach the net zero target. So this really heartens me, because I think that now the Article 6.4 mechanism can be the lighthouse for the international carbon market. It can generate the trust that can bring the financial sector, that of course usually waits until there is a real business case, to come in. And what I would like to also focus on is an issue, the link between the voluntary carbon market and Article 6, because there are many players who of course now would like to convert dust, credits that don't have a real value, into gold, credits that are authorized under the Article 6, where a government says, yes, this is a good credit, I will do the so-called corresponding adjustment. I will be willing to reduce my, to increase my emissions balance by the volume of credits I'm selling, so I'm giving credibility. And therefore, of course, the governments now need to be very careful not to fall into the trap that some independent or voluntary carbon market program tells the government, yeah, we can give you the one-stop shop. We can give you all the methodologies. We can give you the registries, and you only have to sign at the end that you authorize the whole thing. This, of course, is very dangerous because it could mean that the government unwittingly underwrites bad methodologies, underwrites activities that are not additional. And I'm seeing strong efforts by voluntary programs who, of course, have suffered from the downturn of the voluntary market to talk, especially governments from poor countries, governments that don't have the capacity into giving them the blank check for their programs. Singapore has been mentioned earlier. Singapore actually now tries to somehow find a compromise between this. So Singapore has generally approved that almost all large private programs in the voluntary carbon market can create credits under the Article 6.2 collaborative approaches for Singapore. But then Singapore is very choosy when it comes to accepting specific methodologies. Oh, I see, the slides have come up, very good. So this roller coaster here just gives you this, what I was mentioning, the up and down of the carbon markets, and that we are currently back really in the picture, and hopefully will now have a stable market in the long term. On Article 6, one should note, of course, there's this big difference between the collaborative approaches 6.2, where countries can essentially do what they want, and the internationally regulated 6.4 mechanism. And as said, 6.4 is likely to become the benchmark. Of course, it still has a lot of work to do on the nitty-gritties of the regulation, and it also is currently lacking budget because the countries have been unable to allocate the treasure chest that the clean development mechanism has generated over many years to fund now the important work of the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. I really hope that the governments will be able to finally allocate this surplus, because otherwise we have the very strange situation that there is a lot of money sitting around not being used properly, whereas the real work that needs to be done doesn't have funding. I have been mentioning additionality and baselines as the key elements of a credible carbon market project. And one cannot overestimate the relevance of those. I'm hearing often also from financial institutions, yeah, but wouldn't it be better that the highly profitable projects come in? No, the project just needs to make the cut. Otherwise, it would not need the carbon market involvement. And while it may be difficult to understand this at the first glance, it is the critical principle. Of course, there has already been mention of the sustainable development benefits of the activities. It's critical that the projects are not being parachuted and the local communities need to be engaged. And again, Article 6.4 has done a really good step by making it mandatory to have a sustainable development toolkit, where you need to answer all these questions, whether the sustainable development benefits accrue or whether they don't. Here, just to illustrate the point I made earlier on the voluntary programs trying to now convert dust into gold through getting authorizations from the governments. We've seen it in Malawi, we've seen it in Madagascar, we've seen it in Liberia and other places on the African continent where actually such unilateral authorizations have been done. I hope that the market will actually differentiate the prices between credible approaches and approaches that are not credible. And I'm, of course, heartened by attempts of voluntary programs. We've seen the CEO of the Gold Standard present in the earlier panel to really align themselves to the Article 6 rules and particularly to the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. What I, of course, currently see, and the question that we had in the last session illustrated it, there's currently a lot of fighting on certain interpretations for removal credits. How long will one have to monitor the carbon stock that is generated? The regulator draft says it should be monitored for many decades beyond the end of the crediting period of the activity. Of course, the activity developers don't like this. They want to stop the monitoring once the crediting period is over. But again, this is highly risky, and I'm really surprised that even UNEP, the UN Environmental Programme, is underwriting the tax of the activity developers on the regulators. Because if we have a loss of credibility with regard to the permanence of removals or also of stocks that are protected under avoided deforestation, this lack of trust would again contaminate the entire market, and I fear it would pull down the market as it has pulled down the market in the past two instances. And therefore, I would really hope that the activity developers and the institutions that are now calling for relatively short monitoring periods, that are calling for lenient approaches and no liability, that they don't win the day. What is absolutely critical is that the ecosystems, and that is not only the activity developers, but also the financial institutions underwriting them, that they understand that it's better to have a market that may have a small supply of credits, but that may have a high price compared to a market that has a high supply of credits at a low price. Because we've seen in the past that this then leads to an immense supply of credits and a price of zero. And such a market, of course, is not good. So I would really like to convey the key message. We now have the third chance to get a really credible international carbon market up and running. It is led by the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. Everyone who wants a long-term stable market should rally behind the regulators of that mechanism and make this a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Axel, and my sincerest apologies for the technical difficulties, but congratulations on being able to speak off of your slides. So obviously he knows what he's talking about. I think that sets us up really well for our panel, where we'll be digging into actually where the rubber hits the road. How do we actually finance inclusive projects so that they can not only take advantage of this new architecture, but also scale impact in emerging markets and developing economies. So first, I'd like to introduce Reshma Shah, who is the carbon markets lead at Financial Sector Deepening Africa, a specialist development agency that helps to make finance work for Africa's future. I'd also am happy to introduce Dr. James Smith, who is the director and head of nature-based solutions at Poseidon Capital, a firm that invests in nature, supporting the buildup of sustainable blue and green economies. And last but not least, Xavier Pierluca, is the founder and managing partner of Enabling Capital, a leading impact Swiss asset manager that currently advises $700 million in assets within microfinance, as well as access to energy and clean cooking. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. So just to start off, you heard both myself and also Axel refer to this idea of high impact projects of inclusivity. So I'm curious, how do you view inclusivity and impact within your work? And more importantly, how do you see this connecting to some of the, how do you see this building an investment case for carbon projects? Reshma, we'll start with you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm Reshma Shah, Carbon Markets Lead at FSD Africa. FSD Africa is a development agency, a specialist development agency focused particularly around making finance work better in Africa. And my particular role is how do I leverage carbon markets to assist with this capital mobilization. So the heart of inclusive carbon markets and high integrity, high value is quite key to what we're trying to do, because if we don't have that, then we're not going to have a substantial capital mobilization for that. So we're not just keen on actually the carbon credit side only, but the whole ecosystem and how does the value flow across the whole ecosystem. And the way we look at it, and I'd like to relate back to the first panel and the emphasis on business case. And if anybody here has actually tried to deliver a project, and a particularly a high land-based project that requires community involvement, you would know that getting your legal license to operate is extremely easy compared to getting your social license to operate. But more important than getting your social license to operate, maintaining that social license to operate is extremely, extremely difficult. And really, when we talk about inclusivity, it's not about a nice to do. It's not about, I need to give this as part of my corporate social responsibility. It's about core delivery of business. And therefore, when you look at that, and we talked about permanence and we talked about other elements there, if you're not really incorporating the people who actually own that asset, then there's no ownership. And if there's no ownership to it, there is no incentive to actually deliver to that project. So for us, it's really about bringing it into the core of the project. And how have we been doing it at FSD? We've been working on regulations and working with government around ensuring that benefit sharing is a key element of that. In the projects that we work with, the elements around inclusivity is a key criteria that we look at. And for the ones where we can support them further, then we provide technical assistance on how can we enhance this. So I'll stop there, Max, on that.
Thanks, Reshma. I really liked what you said about the social license to operate. And I think, James, this is something that I'm sure is top of mind in your work, because we've seen in a number of nature-based projects where failure to secure that actually leads to failure in the long term. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, thank you very much for that intro, Max. And Reshma, you really put it well when you mentioned the social license to operate. I think that's absolutely key. It's mission critical, fundamental. Not only if you're a project developer looking to implement the projects on the ground, but also if we go back to that previous the panel session that we had earlier, we're talking about how do we scale these markets. Now, we're not going to be able to scale those markets unless we're ensuring that we're delivering best in class on the ground with both the technical and the political license to operate and the social license to operate. And so this is absolutely key to what we want to achieve and to meeting our global goals. And if I'm not looking at anybody in the audience very much, it's because it's blinding here and I can barely see faces. So I apologize about that. But a little bit more, Max, if I may, I really like the slide that you presented earlier, where you had the 4 different elements connecting together, and those are all really, really critical. And I think it was my perspective as a developer and investor in nature-based solutions, we are very often dealing with large rural communities that are very hard to access and are often trapped in poverty and very limited other kind of economic opportunities and livelihoods. And so, although there might be fantastic opportunities to mitigate against climate change, provide adaptation services, support biodiversity, but also provide sustainable development impact, we are also asking very often people with limited resources to make significant changes to their life and how they manage and interact with nature and the landscape and their home, effectively. And so we absolutely have to make sure that that question around benefit sharing and ensuring that they are more than adequately kind of recompensed for any change to their interaction and behavior with those landscapes is front of mind. Because of course, if you're thinking about, if you're a farmer thinking about if I'm going to shift from one activity to another, that immediately connects to what does that mean for my family? What does that mean for my children? What does that mean for their education? What does it mean for their future? How is that going to interact not only in terms of the relationship with my family, but then family with community and stuff. So you absolutely have to have these conversations happening right at the beginning of the project. And these can be quite extensive because we're talking about extremely long-term projects as well. And so that can lead to some delays in relation to nature-based solution development, but it's absolutely critical to provide a project that will succeed because it has the absolute buy-in and the strong participation and desire to see things succeed from the local community. And that then can help, obviously, unlock or provide secure the external financing that you then need to make it push forward. So I'll stop there. It's a huge topic, and there'll be more questions, I'm sure.
Indeed, there will. Xavier, as an investor, I was hoping that you could speak to the investment case for inclusivity. How do you see an inclusive project as delivering a more compelling ROI, or at least kind of promoting more certainty in terms of permanence, in terms of the long-term sort of viability of these projects?
Yeah, no, thank you, Max. Basically, carbon, in what relates to our activity for the Spark Plus Africa Fund, and I will describe a bit the fund as well, is on the side, right? Originally, the core of the fund was to ensure access to clean cooking for the low-income community in sub-Saharan Africa. Carbon is a mechanism, is a mean, right, to achieving our purpose. Our purpose is to ensure that the 900 million people that are cooking in Africa with traditional methods, freestone fires, cooking out of biomass, charcoal, right, move to modern cooking technologies over time. So the inclusiveness, right, is really at the core and of the project, I would say, right, is a key objective. So we are focusing populations that are generally in remote areas, very low-income segment populations, generally from a gender perspective as well, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, it impacts mainly women. There's a significant health impact, as you might be aware, right, when it comes to cooking as well with traditional methods. There are 4 million people who die from household indoor pollution, on a yearly basis. It's significant, mainly women, again, and children. So this was really the core of it, right? When you start with that objective, and you have to be realistic as well as to which type of companies, which type of projects can achieve your purpose, right? And it has to be done in a sustainable way and commercially viable way as well. So putting all of that together is not always easy. So in what relates to Spark Plus, to speak a bit about it, right? The way to engage, first of all, was to structure a blended finance fund. So the fund is 7 years. It has 4 layers. We benefit from money from the African Development Bank, in reality CEFA, a donor fund, the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, the European Commission. Above, we have other layers, mezzanine piece from DFIs, foundations, and then this has allowed us to actually mitigate the perception of risk with investors that are pension funds or family offices and private investors. So this fund is 7 years. And we needed quite some time in order to ensure, right, that we would be able to engage with the variety of companies and fuel types on the ground to deliver clean cooking. So part of that, we would work with quasi-equity instrument directly with SMEs. We work with debt, and we do carbon projects, right? Which is, I think, trying to link everything we do to the core topic here. In what relates to carbon projects, right? The key component for us was to ensure that we were targeting the right population to start with, in the right geographic area, right? And that had all of the other components in terms of carbon integrity, in terms of methodology, in terms of offtake potentially as well, adequate sponsor experience, but also in Africa, engaging with distributors on the ground, right? So experienced distributors that can actually achieve what is lacking the most when you engage in such a large continent is the last mile. How do you reach the low-income segment, right? How do you ensure that your distributors are sustainable as well to ensure the viability of the project? So as a result of that, we looked at 40 projects, carbon. We ended up investing only in 4 of them currently. One of them is actually the first Article 6.2 project in clean cooking, so between Ghana and Switzerland, which was sponsored by EnviroFit. So we sponsored basically the manufacturing site in Ghana and the distribution as well, finance all of these operations. We have dealt with VCM, also projects in Zambia, in remote areas. And now we are working at structuring blended finance vehicles within a blended finance vehicle. So a bit more structuring, let's say, right, in order to engage in more innovation. Because, we speak a lot in clean cooking about biomass stoves at the end of the day, and we want to move to the next phase, right? So now we are moving to electric appliances as well, which are untested, of course. But as a result of that, we need additional layers of protection in order to engage private investors to do so. So it is indeed complex from a structuring standpoint, right? But at the end of the day, we must never forget, the core objective, which is basically women in Africa, that end up, cooking with dignity on a proper, basically, appliance that is of quality.
Super interesting, Xavier. And I want to come back to Spark Plus later. I think it's really interesting how you've actually structured that fund and the role that various kind of types of investors have played, especially the development finance institutions in helping to de-risk investment for the family offices and asset managers that you mentioned. But I guess maybe first a question to James. So we heard about a solution, and particularly in clean cooking, but nature-based, obviously, you're facing a whole sort of different set of challenges and different financing needs for that matter, especially when we talk about the time horizon that we're looking at to actually generate credits, see returns, much less break even. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges that nature-based solutions projects face in raising capital? And maybe also kind of speak to whether some of the same solutions that Xavier mentioned also would be relevant in that context.
Thanks. Yeah, that's quite a broad remit. I'll start with the first point that comes to mind. I think nature-based solutions are a challenging space to be working in because of the context of extremely large landscapes, long time frames, large numbers of people. This is particularly in an African context, which means that we typically probably have a longer pathway to development than we would like potentially see in a cook stove project. Predominantly for that because that FPIC process, getting that social license to operate, it's not something that necessarily you can say, well, we'll start on this date, it's a 12-month process, it's going to be done by this date. To provide that free, prior and informed consent. Now, giving free consent is perhaps not the hard bit, but is it informed? That's the really, really difficult section. And can it be consent if it's not informed? And so, as we mentioned, kind of dealing with rural communities that may have not had the same educational opportunities that we had, and we're asking them potentially to make quite significant changes in the way they manage their landscapes. That's something which cannot necessarily be kind of we expect that to be done in 6 months. And it's an ongoing process, right? That social license to operate, once a project is up and running, you have to make sure that they still have that license to operate with the communities. And so that means that there's that long developmental pathway. And so there's a really, really critical need for concessional finance at that early stage to help cover that bridge to the point at which a project is up and running and it perhaps has either been validated or verified, so it can issue credits, at which point it can start either self-financing or it will be able to access other forms of capital. But very often the investors themselves don't want to get involved until they've seen something operational, and not just a feasibility study, but they want to see a pilot study. They want to see that not only have you got that social license to operate, but you're also investing in someone who's got to manage potentially thousands of individuals and thousands of hectares. And so that is a critical need as well. And so we definitely need to find, and blended finance, concessional capital, I think is what we're going to explore further in this panel, but that is really, really crucial in providing this financing gap between getting that feasibility or having that concept and actually getting to a point where an investment is then bankable, as it were.
Reshma, so we've heard about how we can actually make this work, but I guess the question that I have is that missing from this conversation so far has been the role of commercial banks. And particularly on the African continent, I know that a big part of your role is actually capacity building for local financial institutions. We had actually tried to get a financial institution to join us today. It wasn't possible. But obviously, you know sort of their, you know the challenges they face well. You know the opportunities on the continent. And particularly, there are estimates that suggest that Africa could generate up to $6 billion in revenue by the end of this decade via global carbon markets. So I guess the question is, we see investors getting involved. We see institutional investors, obviously with the support of development funders, getting involved. But why do we not see commercial banks playing a bigger role?
So when we talk about 6 billion, and just putting that in context, at the moment, Africa probably sells about less than 4% of carbon credits globally, and about 2% of its potential. So look at the upside of what that really looks like. Now, it's not that the commercial banks are not kind of interested. They're just not convinced about carbon markets at the moment. And a big part of the role that we play is really around local capital mobilization. And that's why bringing in the financial institutions here, meaning the banks, insurance, the pension funds, asset managers, is extremely important. Just to give an example, we recently ran a program for East African financial institutions. We had about 50 of the top financial institutions in East Africa. And we asked for kind of senior level management for a 2.5-day training on carbon markets. And this wasn't a theoretical training. We actually went out and got people who were actually working in the space to give them examples, tools, etc. Over 80% of the participants said that they were interested in carbon markets but didn't know much at all. At the end of this 2.5 days, our last session was, okay, so what are you going to do with this information? It's not just come here for 2.5 days and walk away. So we created 3 different working groups, one for banks, one for insurance, and one for asset managers. And we're working through that now because there is interest, but the challenges that the financial institutions are facing is, one, the long periods that it takes to actually see the projects through, the intangible nature of a majority of the projects, the fact that a lot of our banking, for example, is very corporate banking. You need collateral. So what is the collateral I'm getting here on the carbon project? But in addition to these challenges, there are a lot of other mechanisms that we're trying to introduce as part of these working groups. Elements around bringing other players in, so where there's different phases of the project, where you can have different types of funding, where we can bring in the blended structures, where we can bring in, for example, first loss guarantees as well, but also where we can syndicate, where we can syndicate with international banks, where have a lot more experience in this, and give comfort to some of the local kind of institutions. And the DFIs play quite a big role in that as well. I don't think we're necessarily going to unlock carbon markets in Africa if we don't carry along the local financial institutions as well. And we have seen examples. Robank in DRC was the first mover in the region to actually fund carbon markets. At the end of this month, we're in West Africa to run a similar program on financial institutions as well.
And I guess a follow-up to that is it feels almost kind of like a chicken or egg conundrum, where we want banks to take a larger role in financing these projects. But at the same time, there seems to be sort of both a lack of infrastructure on the African continent, as well as a dearth of pipeline of kind of high integrity, high impact projects. So how do we solve that? What comes first? Do we need to build the capacity of the banks first, or do we need to actually build a more viable carbon markets infrastructure on the African continent? Or is it both?
It's actually both at the same time, really, because they inform each other as well. When you think about the infrastructure and the kind of enabling environment as well, they give comfort to the banks, and that helps with some of the kind of platforms that we're looking at around how do we move banks away from project risk to portfolio risks as well. And that's where the infrastructure and the enabling environment becomes extremely important. But even with the banks themselves, in terms of, we've all been here, and nobody's sitting here saying carbon markets is perfect and we have all the answers and they're all working. But they are a tool and part of an integrated solution that's quite key in driving some key sectors in Africa. And what we are trying to do with the financial institutions is stop looking at this as a pure carbon markets project, because then it's big, scary, and new. But then, when you're talking about clean cooking and energy, or whether you're talking about nature and agriculture, are you funding energy projects? Are you funding agriculture projects at the moment? Let's start with that. Let's work with that. And carbon becomes just another income stack, another revenue stack, another element that we can build on through capacity building as part of that, rather than looking at this as completely something new and in isolation.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because that was another question that I wanted to dig into, which is this heterogeneity within, amongst carbon projects, right? So you have pure carbon plays, say a Red Plus project, but you also have the clean cook stove distributors, right? Which have a core business. They have, they're already generating revenue from the sale of cook stoves. And carbon is just another sort of revenue stream that can help to support them to break even, to become profitable. So, I mean, I guess we have sort of representatives of kind of the two sides here, right? Something that's more pure carbon, not exclusively, but and then also kind of the more social enterprise model. And I'm curious, James and Xavier, how do you see the financing structure differing between, say, and the players involved, between a pure carbon play and something that's more of a social enterprise accessing carbon finance?
Yeah, no, so we finance basically throughout the value chain, right, on our end. So we look at manufacturers, designers of solutions, distributors, and FIs as well. So we have fairly standard, financing instruments, I would say, for FIs, but it's quite difficult to engage them, and maybe I can touch on that as well. And carbon projects, which are extremely cumbersome and complex, right? I mean, we end up with, in some cases, 5-6 layers of agreements with the sponsor, with the service level agreement, with distributors on the ground, offtake agreement, financing agreement, you name it. One topic, that I'd like to touch on when it comes to FI, actually, as well, is the difficulty of the carbon market and the carbon markets, right? Because it's something that is fairly opaque at the end of the day. Many people in this room might understand VCM, Article 6, right? Compliance market in different regions. Quite sincerely, for most people, out there, it's something that is completely unknown. They just know that there is a mechanism that is market-based somehow. right? That makes it very difficult to engage with FI, I would say. Financial institutions, and having been, in prior work on the board of microfinance institutions or banks, are generally, unfortunately, and I love them, we still work with them, we finance 150 MFIs, they're quite lazy, right? I mean, they want to do something that works well, right? They have a product or a service that they can place with clients. They're not going to engage in something new and they don't really fully comprehend, right? So one way to engage them is through the financing of the appliance acquisition by the end clients, which is what we do. We end up nevertheless working a lot with tier 2 and tier 3 structures, I would say, because they're the ones that engage with the low-income segment, that are generally working in more remote areas as well, and that are also willing to take financing with strings attached, right? Because let's face it as well, between a financing arm, right, that is going to offer you a loan, whatever it is, right, with no strings attached, and someone that tells you, I would love you to engage in clean carbon with an incentive to decrease your rate, you're going to choose the guys that are basically telling you, take the money and repay me when you can, or, per the plan that we have. So that's the difficulty. But as a result, indeed, right, all of these different players require very different way to analyze. I would say when we look at SMEs, for example, we completely carve out the carbon element of it, because many distributors are the recipient to an extent of commissions or kickbacks from sponsors, right, or developers when it comes to carbon projects. They don't always understand what they're dealing with themselves. And there's a lot of unknown as to the ability, of the sponsor to pay them depending on the sponsor that they deal with. So we carve that out. But we engage, when we look more at the receivable finance aspect of it, where there is a generation of revenue. It's very much like microfinance, right? It's asset financing at the end of the day with pay-as-you-go mechanism or loans. So we look at a receivable pool of assets. We look at inventory finance as well. So very, very different, if you like, structures. But at the end of the day, indeed, right, to link it again back to carbon, we realize that even indirectly, a significant portion of the success of these companies that are not directly sponsors or developers of projects rely for probably 30% of their revenue or their cost base, right, to the carbon market, whether they like it or not. So it's something that we must comprehend, we must assess, but nevertheless, we prefer to ensure that the project walks on its 2 feet without the third leg of carbon before we engage.
That makes a lot of sense. So James, very different context, very different model.
Very different context. Most of the types of projects that I'm involved in are things like avoided deforestation, forest restoration, blue carbon projects, and really they end up standing on carbon, and that makes it very, very tricky. So if I think about that first generation of carbon projects, established 2012 with all of the excitement about RED Plus that came up 10, 15 years ago, some of the most well-known projects in the market were entirely concessional grant-based financed. And that's a completely different system to what we're looking at now. And so now we've got to the system where we know that there is a maturing market, both voluntary and compliance, which can provide the operating costs once it's up and running. We still have this huge gap in the middle. We have donors and technical assistance facilities providing small ticket sizes for an initial feasibility study, maybe the first check for a small pilot, and then we have people who want the credits but none of the risk in the middle. And so that's what that makes this space very, very challenging. And so thinking about how we can bridge that gap is critical if we want to see nature-based solutions expand. Because we're kind of stuck in a situation now where I see that there's kind of the first generation of projects or project developers which have benefited from significant amounts of concessional capital, which means they now have revenues which allows them to replicate their model. Now, the most high impactful opportunities that we see may not be from those same entities, and it's limiting the opportunity to replicate that across Africa and in other locations around the world, because the organization which has perhaps the strongest impact opportunity, the strongest license to operate, the strongest knowledge of the challenges in the landscape are ones which are, have not entered into this market before, and they don't have the track record. So we really need to find ways to bridge this gap and to make them bankable. And the problem again is, of course, that we also have to come back to the people who are part of these projects. They, as I've mentioned, will be changing the way they interact, how they manage their land, how they interact with the forest, what resources they can take, whether they need to partition part of the forest, part of their land to grow trees, etc. That comes at an immediate cost with a revenue in the future. Like, we need to find opportunities to make these projects fly, we have to start from the very moment that first spade goes in the ground, that first tree is planted. There is a reward, a financial reward for that opportunity cost, because at the moment, it's so far in the future, it's really tricky.
It's a very good point, because I think we sometimes just think about, okay, eventually these credits will be generated, they will be sold, we will realize some revenue. But in reality, let's take an agroforestry project, for example. Those trees will not be there in 7 years if the farmers have not been compensated up front for taking land out of rotation, right? I mean, this is something that a lot of times gets lost in the conversation about regenerative agriculture or nature-based or agroforestry, or for that matter, reducing deforestation. Communities might rely on cutting down the forest for farmland, for selling firewood. So if you're not providing an immediate benefit, then what's to stop them from going back? And that's where that kind of threat to permanence comes in. And that's really where I see that link between integrity and impact. So I guess maybe one final question to all of you before we open it up to the audience for questions. How do you see investors, and banks for that matter, valuing that inclusivity, that impact that does lead to permanence in the long term? Because I think we think of it from a development standpoint, right? It makes sense that we should be benefiting these communities. But from a commercial standpoint, are they really assessing the importance of impact to their returns on their investment?
Is that me?
Sure, you go ahead.
Yes. And this is, I think, comes back to a point that Reshma, you brought up, or the conversation around local banks. Yes, investors are looking at that in phenomenal depth, and that is why there are predominantly carbon-focused funds, because it brings a whole different, it requires a whole different technical expertise in order to go through the due diligence to really understand, have we the social license to operate? Are we planting the right species in the right time? Have we got the right rates of carbon sequestration or avoided emissions and all the rest of it? These are skills and knowledge that I don't necessarily see in some of the local institutions and potentially some of the other financial institutions. So it can be a challenge in that regard, which is why I think a lot of these projects are very much related on or focused on international finance from specific carbon funds. They can also often get, I think, lower cost of capital than the domestic markets. And so that's another circle that we have to kind of to tick off if we're really going to kind of support the growth of these markets in the countries where the projects are being developed. So they are very much looking at it. They're looking at it from a risk and an opportunity perspective, particularly coming down to, like we said, these are projects of maybe 15 to 20, maybe even 40 years long. You need to be absolutely sure, if you are investing in that project, that everybody wants to be pulling in the same direction as a team to make that work. Because any kind of hint that we do not have full buy-in and all stakeholders are aligned around this joint venture is going to lead to potential issues in the future. And so that's one of the major things that as an investor you're looking at. It has to be absolutely, top-notch.
Reshma, do you think that banks can get there?
I think banks will look at the commercial value. and if they can see the value in terms of the buyers putting value to that, then they will get that. And just to quickly answer initially, we believe that there is value to it, but we're testing that theory at FSD right now. So we've got the Carbon Accelerator Program for the environment, CAPE, over 130 projects applied for this. 4 projects got selected, one in the corner there, Tom, with Linda Group. And one of the key criteria was around this inclusivity that we looked at. We're looking at how can we scale these up. So there's a living lab as part of CAPE where all the learnings, we're continuously engaging with buyers and investors. And in putting CAPE together, we did a whole round of engagements with investors and buyers to try and understand, you know, this theory of change that we're trying to prove, is it the right one that we're trying? So hopefully with CAPE, we'll have actual concrete evidence that there is value attached to this as well.
Great, thank you. And Xavier?
I know very quickly because the time is running.
Oh, don't worry, don't worry. We have plenty of time. But
no, I mean, definitely, I mean, I think to answer your questions on do investors care about this inclusivity, first of all, I mean, if there is no additionality, right, and I think Max described that earlier, right, in what relates to the Article 6, I don't think investors will move forward with carbon projects, no? They're also interested in the co-benefits, I would say, of different projects, right? It's very different for agroforestry or vanities for clean cooking, of course. Very different impact, but they want the sponsors, they want the fund managers to demonstrate that you have a theory of change, that you monitor, right, the data, and not only from a quantitative standpoint, but from a qualitative standpoint as well. So this is quite essential. But the core of the issue, right, because let's assume that all of the sponsors and fund managers do their work properly, will eventually rely on the carbon integrity and the methodologies, and in what relates to clean cooking, the appliance that is sold to the client, right? This is quite essential. And a lot of harm has been done to carbon, and as a result, you know, the selling of appliances to our target clients of malpractice and greed, right, in the last few years. So we have to be very careful about that. We have to be more transparent, I think. And also, if we want to broaden the scope, you know, of investors that can invest in these markets, we have to make it more easy to understand, right? Just trying to understand what carbon market means for clean cooking takes several months. There's no really easily accessible information to understand what it means to be a good project or a bad project. What are the methodologies? And I think the same is true for many other sectors within carbon. If we don't democratize it, we're not going to allow to meet our objectives and targets. There are too many investors that feel, let's say, left out in their corners and without adequate knowledge to engage.
All right, we'll leave it there, and then I'll invite Axel to join us back on stage. And then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Let's take, we have 2, 3. Why don't we take 3 just to start?
May I? Thank you. I'm Jacques Bopp, based in Geneva, also working on clean cooking. So I would like to maybe give a specific question to Xavier, and congratulations on the Ghana project. Talking about democratizing success, can you share a bit more, shed light on what you've done in Ghana? Have you invested in the manufacturing company of the LPG stove? Have you more or less provided credit to the projects themselves, on one hand? And on the second hand, how did it work with Click Foundations? Can you share a bit more about the price of the carbon that you've been able to secure on that one? Thank you.
Yes. No, lots of questions I can't answer, unfortunately. You have to ask the responsible parties for that directly, I guess, specifically when it relates to price. In what relates, to our involvement, right? We have been basically supporting the sponsor, which was in that case Envirofit for the 6.2 project. ensuring that they could install the capacity on the ground in Ghana, train staff to manufacture appliances, and then support them with the manufacturing process of the stoves, the distribution and selling of the stoves to the end client, right? So our role is really basically supporting the sponsor and in financing the project. At the end of the day, we end up being a beneficiary of the agreement between the, let's say, two countries, right, as well as the intermediary via complex agreement mechanisms, if you'd like, right, which are very boring to explain to the entire audience. Very exciting for us, but probably not very interesting. But yes, that's the way it works. We're also working in Ghana, by the way, on LPG, which we consider an important transition fuel when it comes to clean cooking, specifically for some given countries in Africa that are either close to the supply or are suppliers themselves. And they're looking into it as well, but these are other projects. So we have a project finance under the new CRM methodology, which is a cylinder recirculation model of cylinders in Ghana, which is quite important as well. That's a pure project finance. In that case, we work with an oil and gas company that is working up and downstream, and we are facilitating the support of their bottling plant, the development of a bottling plant, and the acquisition of cylinders in order to lower the impact that cylinders have on safety, basically, and many explosions do occur in Africa, as you might be aware. So ensuring that we can implement on the new policies that have been agreed and approved by Parliament.
Go ahead, and then we have another in the back.
Hello, my name is Tom Kagera. I'm the CEO of Flinder. Thanks, Reshma, for mentioning us as part of the CAPE Accelerator program. If it's helpful, I can actually provide a concrete example how inclusive restoration projects could look like. Yeah. So I give you a little story. I was in Kenya 2 weeks ago. We brought the Kenyan Forest Service, which is our counterpart at the government in Kenya, to the coast of Kenya in Kwale County. And we were hosting this meeting together with them with the local community in a community center. And that community center was built by the community from funds from our carbon restoration project with the local communities. So we pay communities for planting the trees. We buy all the trees from nurseries from the local communities. So even before we even talk about carbon revenue sharing with the local community, there is a steady income to these households. And they use this money to build quite entrepreneurially a community center that they now rent out to people like us that have to pay to use their center for functions. So they're very entrepreneurial. They started community lending programs based with the money that they already generated. And it's just I think a really important point that you all made and that I can totally emphasize and provide a concrete example that if you involve them and give them economic benefit from the beginning, then you have the strongest buy-in for your project that you can imagine. And I would like to add a second flavor to you said about the communities. For me, they're not only someone that you need to integrate into the project and you need to get the social license. It's actually they are a force of labor, and they're a force of I called it yesterday climate warriors. So if you incentivize them, if you align restoration objectives with the economic needs of these people, then we have millions of people out there that will help us to solve this climate crisis by planting trees and benefiting from the growth in the long term. Hope it was helpful.
Excellent contributions. Thank you so much. Please.
Yes, Mary Jean Buer. I'm a professor in Lucerne, teaching innovation management, design thinking, change management, and also a consultant working on nature-related disclosures, financial disclosures for UNCTAD, the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. So the question is, following on that, actually it's about retail banking. And how can we involve them? I'm thinking back to the times when I worked on the energy transition. There was a company in Switzerland, Energio, by the way, that uses a blended finance approach to finance local sustainable energy projects where they have crowdfunding from the community combined with other types of financing to get the projects done. So in this case, the community cannot pay for it, but we can pay for it. Myself, I have a bank, I will just say which one it is, UBS. I've had it for 27 years because I came to EPFL when I came here in 1997, and I was taken by UBS, and I just stayed. But now I'm thinking, finally, 27 years later, shall I change that? Shall I go to a bank that actually does something with my money and gives me back something more than just a low interest rate? So, I won't mention names, but there's been companies here that have interested me where I can put my money. They do things with my money. And that's not just about money, that's about impact. What do they do with our money when they keep it? So my question is, how can retail banking mobilize all the people like myself that want to do some good with their money and use that to invest, like the crowdfunding approach that Energio is doing here in Switzerland for sustainable energy investments. We finance the part that is so hard, the upfront cost that you just talked about, that the other people don't want to finance because they want to see the carbon credits later when they're already produced. Thank you.
Thank you. Reshma, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Yeah. So prior to taking on this role at FSD Africa, I was the head of sustainability for an African-based financial institution, the largest in East and Central Africa. And one of the things I had exactly suggested is when we look at banks, we look at the debt side, but we don't look at the deposit side at all. And actually, that could be an extremely rich way of saying, why are all our products on sustainability in Africa focused on the debt side? Why can't we offer a deposit side, a sustainability product that allows the types of investors to say, I will either take a reduced interest on that deposit or any other element if that money goes to certain projects like sustainability. And that would actually be a way of also allowing people to take on a bigger risk. Because what we hear a lot is, as banks, we are responsible for our depositors' money, but then allow the depositors to make a decision in terms of how their money is being spent. So I'm hoping as part of these working groups that we're having with the financial institutions, that they start looking at it in that perspective. But also your point around, and I just want to add to it, is it's not just the project developer that we need to focus on when we're looking at financial institutions. Some of the examples around the community, if we look at the ecosystem, there's other things that can actually help with inclusivity. And this is why when we're working with financial institutions, we're saying to them, don't just focus on the carbon project, try and understand the whole ecosystem, who feeds into that, who are the suppliers, who are the beneficiaries, and they are your customer base, not just the project developer. And those are some of the kind of, we want to bring into it with the financial institutions. And hopefully, next time we're here, there's actually a product on the deposit side as well.
You said something really interesting there that I actually want to redirect also to Xavier, which is thinking about carbon project participants not just as beneficiaries, but also as customers. And obviously you have been an investor in microfinance for many years, and you mentioned that in the clean cooking projects that you're invested in, oftentimes you're bringing in local tier 2 or 3 microfinance institutions to actually finance the assets for households. This is something that in CGAP's work we've been trying to make the case for, that actually carbon projects are an opportunity for financial institutions to acquire new customers, especially in cases where they might be receiving revenue, say, for example, in a nature-based project. So I guess but at the same time, we've also spoken to microfinance institutions who are maybe hesitant to get involved in this, probably because of lack of understanding or capacity, which is something that I know Reshma is working on and she mentioned. But I guess for you, do you see financial institutions as seeing that opportunity, that carbon projects are actually an opportunity to bank some customers that to date have not had reliable access to formal financial services?
Yes, but slowly. So yes, but they require a lot of education, right, and training at the end of the day. Again, because they're very far away from this concept of the carbon markets, generally speaking, especially, with the type of population that they deal with. So this is flying a little bit above their heads, right? So we have to, make these projects understandable, right, by the loan officers as well. It's not the management of these banks. They're perfectly capable of understanding, but then they have to, ensure that the message goes down to the loan officers. And as a result, engage with the clients and provide the clients with the appliances and the financing that is adequate for them to acquire this type of solutions as well, right? So we provide technical assistance to banks to do that, but these are complex programs and not always very successful. The best success we've had is in reality always, coming from money, the money incentive, right? So we lower your rate if you improve your output, no? And on that basis, we've had some success. I think, we're still in year 3 of the fund right now. We'll really assess, the impact we've had on financial institutions locally in 4 years from now. But it's going in the right direction, I think, for many players. May I just touch on the topic that was raised earlier, right? Because access to retail, I think, is the dream of all fund managers and sponsors, right? So first of all, there are banks indeed in the world that operate in a sustainable manner, right? That are based in Europe. There are banks in Switzerland that actually engage, in a sustainable manner with their clients and the projects that they find. They can welcome your savings. But also savings, but also, there's an issue of regulation, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if you cannot invest your money in projects like ours, it's because they're risky projects, and the regulator wants to make sure that you're protected, that, we are not basically badly engaging with your savings, your pension money as well, which is making it quite complicated for the population at large, including myself, to invest in the projects that I develop on a daily basis. I cannot invest in my own projects, or I cannot invest in James' projects for that matter at all. This is impossible. So, we need to crack the nut there, right? Something must be thought in what relates to regulation, banking regulation, investment regulation as well. But so far, since the late, let's say for the last 10 years, after the CLO, CDO crisis, right, in housing, some carbon crises, internet crashes, right, the regulator has had a tendency to restrict more than to open the rules, for retail to projects like ours. So we need to strike the right balance. I'm perfectly unable to do so and to make any sort of recommendation. We just know, all of us, that it's needed, right?
Thank you. Other questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you very much. Michael from ITMO, 20 years in carbon markets and 15 years at the COP negotiations. I just wanted to build a bridge, if I may, between what Axel was saying before you intervened or intervened, because I think there's a critical element here that maybe you haven't either uncovered or addressed. And by the way, Axel, that was probably the best presentation of this conference by far, simply because you've delineated in a very, very simple way how to get involved in Article 6 and the new Paris Agreement carbon market. And I would encourage everybody to get the presentation from Axel. Under Article 6, there is this thing called the Cancun Safeguards. And this relates precisely to what you are talking about. There's 3 big buckets in the Cancun Safeguards. There's the SDG bucket, there's the biodiversity bucket, and there's, of course, the local communities and indigenous peoples bucket. Now, why am I saying this? Because I think because of these new regulations and rules that Axel has been talking about, it is highly risky, even if you respected the SDG, the local communities, and the biodiversity of your project, if you had not done a proper due diligence with the government itself to see that they have abided to the Cancun safeguards. Because I can use the example of Kenya, I can use the example of Ghana. What is the point? It matters not if the Ghana project delivers the carbon reductions or removals and you're respecting your SDGs. If your neighbor completely obliterates 10% of Ghana's biodiversity, 10 of its SDGs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you understand where I'm trying to get at. Is there's this element and this critical element. It's nobody's fault. It's just all this is new. But unless you address that at national level and with Ghana's government first, and you do the proper due diligence, that's what you need to show to the investors. Because ultimately, the institutional investors and the global banks that we work with, they want to see that. Because at the end of the day, if somebody doesn't respect that, they will bear the brunt of the risk, especially on the reputational side. They don't really care about the financial side, to be honest. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that into this discussion and build that bridge.
Maybe first Axel and then Reshma.
Well, I totally agree that it is important to ensure that the inclusive characteristics of the project are aligned with what we've now seen under development. And it was really interesting, under this clean development mechanism, there was a voluntary sustainable development tool. Only very few developers actually used it. Now it's mandatory. And I would hope that those who actually have applied the tool under the CDM will be able to help those who now have to get into this and previously didn't put sufficient effort on it to actually be credible. Because, yeah, otherwise I would fear we see a number of activities not passing validation, even if they are coming with a good and generic approach.
Reshma?
Yeah, I was just going to quickly add to that, and 100% agreed. And we were at the Africa Climate Summit in Addis, and we ran certain sessions there around what we were calling a landscape approach. So bringing in demand, supply, and enabling environment together and connecting the dots, because the discussions were too separate between demand and supply. And as part of that, there's a Article 6 readiness tracking mechanism and working group that's being set up at a country level, national level, to address exactly that, so that we can feel comfortable, not just at a project level, but at a national level, that we're actually ready to meet those demands. Yeah, 100% on that, yeah.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Or I know we have another question in the back.
Thank you. I'm Lucas from Planet 2050. We invest in nature-based and engineered reductions and removals. The question is about understanding all new rules that apply from domestic markets, especially for international carbon credit transactions. We see many countries implementing taxes, levies, fees on the primary and sometimes the secondary transactions of carbon credits, which I think when we talk about inclusion and benefit sharing is a good thing. But in the same time, I think it creates also some challenges. And I wanted to see, what is your view on this? What trends do you observe? And also, how do we harmonize all the rules that are being implemented by each independent countries? Thank you.
Important point. Okay, Axel, and then James, did you want to also address that? Go ahead, Axel.
Yeah, well, of course, it's every country's sovereignty to decide on the taxation level. We've, of course, seen Ghana as a front runner to say, okay, $5 per ton for authorization and $3 for the small-scale projects. So that, of course, was a kind of front-runner approach, but I would expect that we see a hodgepodge of different levels of tax. Of course, the competition will mean that the differences can't be so huge, but I don't see any possibility to really get harmonization.
I very much agree. I'd very much love to see harmonization. That would make life a lot easier. It is becoming increasingly challenging for a developer, given the state of the market. I mean, we've discussed kind of some of the challenges it's had in terms of project additionality, permanence, and some of the additional kind of concerns that have been brought in terms of how and when can a corporate use a credit, which has added a certain degree of uncertainty over the last 2 to 3 years, although there's obviously huge amounts of good momentum in the other direction, right, which is supporting those expectations that the market, at least for nature-based solutions, will be 4 or 5 times the size of this in 2030. However, much of the legislation is very rightly ensuring that there is an explicit benefit share towards all of the different stakeholders. But that is perhaps, very different countries have very different percentages. Some are focusing very heavily on ensuring that all comes into treasury. Others are focusing very heavily that all goes into the underlying kind of landowners or those with actual land tenure. Now, when that makes it very difficult as a project developer to have kind of consistent approaches, because dealing with project off-takers or people who want to invest in the project, it's tricky then to determine an exact percentage that would go into the local communities post the project being operational. And it gets particularly tricky because countries are ensuring that they take that right share of a royalty or whatever on the credits. However, it's all going on revenues, which makes it extremely difficult as a project developer then to manage your costs and to, you can see where the issue is.
No, I mean, would it be fair to say that it's not so much, I mean, I would agree with Axel. I mean, this is the sovereign right of countries, right? But I guess it really comes down to certainty. Right,
yeah.
And I think in many cases where the challenge comes in is that some countries kind of move the goalposts a bit.
And it's happened multiple times in the last year, particularly examples like Zimbabwe.
I completely agree on the sovereign point. The one thing I say that we can do to influence it is how to bring together the different parts of the government that are looking at this, because you'll find that the Ministry of Environment or NDAs are looking at it from a community benefit sharing and saying that anything to do with tax is not ours, it's treasury, but to look at it holistically and to kind of push for some kind of coordination mechanism at that country level, that you can actually take a whole project and actually look at the revenue and the allocation across the whole project to understand what it means holistically. Not an easy task to try and get government to look at it in that perspective, but it's probably the only way that we can actually try and change that.
Very important point. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I'm going to ask one final question in 30 seconds. Oh, sorry, you have one more thing to add.
Just what I wanted to mention is that the uncertainty created by this taxation, right, differences and change, I mean, the worst is the changing of the rule of the game in the midst of the project. It happens a lot, actually, right? So as a result of that, we factor a rate of return on this project that is increasingly high, which is not to the benefit of the end, basically, beneficiaries, right? So that's also something to think about, but it's, unfortunately, as you said, it's the sovereign right of each and every country.
Right, it essentially just adds to the risk premium, right? Yeah. Okay, so in the 2 minutes that we have left, I want to ask each of you, in 30 seconds or less, if we were back here on this stage 5 years from now, what would success look like to you? Axel?
Well, I hope we see hundreds of projects under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, and we see a trust of governments and private sector to buy these credits.
Yes, I mean, in what relates to us, carbon, as I said, is a tool, right? Is a mean, it's to an end. We would like to see clean cooking, access to clean cooking actually being improved. So seeing a reduction in Africa, right, to somehow half of what it is today, right, in terms of providing access to the population.
I'd add on what Axel said. I'd also like to make sure that we've got a good representation in nature moving forwards in these trades. But on top of that, I mean, we've been talking about inclusion, but I'd certainly like to talk about equity as well. I think that moving forwards, this discussion around benefit share should perhaps evolve into something of equal partners in project development, and actually the communities that are potentially, or the individuals that are providing their land, actually becoming kind of part of the fundamental governance structure moving forward. So moving maybe a little bit from inclusion to equity.
Yeah, and I'd say for me is the ability to be able to actually see that there is equity or inclusion in that sense, to be able to measure it, but to be able to show that there's value attached to it as well, because that's the only way we can keep it going. So.
And I think that's an excellent place to leave it. Thank you everyone so much. Thanks to our panel. And appreciate you all joining us today.